Hello and welcome to this part 10 in our series Chosen to Serve. We're in Philippians chapter 3 and I want to take a little diversion today. I want to ask the question, how has your childhood impacted the rest of your life? Does it have any bearing on what you're doing now? I have a friend who died recently. He interviewed me for church membership at Chatsworth Baptist Church in West Norwood when I was first a Christian, and that was 61 years ago. And, for most of his working life, my friend John would say, I shouldn't have become a doctor. His father was a doctor, and he was expected to follow in a family tradition. But he didn't like it. He didn't like going into work and saying, I've just got to write chits for all these people who want to skive off work. He said, I really should have been a gardener. Oh, he loved his garden. It was a beautiful, beautiful garden. And we spent many happy hours there. We even built a stone wall together and had great fun doing it. However, he had to take early retirement because his wife became ill and eventually she died. But he said, now I'm free to travel with you. And he did. He traveled with me to America, to South Africa, I think to Kenya, to Ukraine many times. And now he enjoyed being a doctor because he could be useful in ministry. Very often if a team member became sick, John would be there to help. Or if we were in a hospital in Ukraine and trying to determine what kind of equipment they needed, John would tell us, and he could work, of course, with the doctors there as an equal. I wouldn't have known where to start, but he was very helpful, you see. God knew. God had prepared him in advance for that. I look at my own childhood. I grew up in an orphanage, certainly didn't like it, hated it in fact. At the age of 15, I left school, and that meant leaving the orphanage, which I was very happy to do. However, it meant that I was homeless, and many's the night I'd spend under the sky looking up at the stars and the moon. And then, of course, I went to prison, like so many other orphans. Don't know how many orphans have been to prison, but I can assure you, per head of population, it's a whole lot more because of a lack of preparation for real life. However, God knew. For most of my adult life, I've worked with people on the edge of society. I've worked with orphans, done a huge amount of work in Ukraine, in the orphanages there, putting in indoor toilet facilities because the only toilets that were available were 3 holes in the ground, 100 yards from the main house. We put in new central heating system because the children were freezing cold. Re-roofed, put in a new sewage system in one of the orphanages. And all of that because I grew up in an orphanage and I knew that life was pretty hard. I've worked with people on the streets. For much of my adult life, I've worked with people on the edge of society. We rescued homeless children. 2 of my own sons, my adopted boys, were children that were rescued from homelessness. And in prisons, I've worked in prisons on 3 continents. When I was at school, I remember my teacher saying, Jackopson, you'll spend your life in and out of jail. Of course, he meant it in a different way, but he was quite right. And that's because God prepared me in advance for this work, you see. Now that's where I am with the Apostle Paul today. You see, the Apostle Paul says these words, "If someone thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have even more." Now, he was not saying that as a boast. He was simply saying it because, as we shall see in our next session, all of that was to his profit, he counts as nothing. And yet, there's a very real sense in which it wasn't nothing. There's a very real sense in which it was part of God's preparation for what the Apostle Paul was to do in his life. I came across Tom Holland, a secular historian. This is the word that he said. Paul's letters, along with the four Gospels, are the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world. When I think of Paul, I think of him as a depth charge, deep beneath the foundations of the classical world. It's not something you would particularly notice if you were in Corinth or in Alexandria at that time. Then you get this kind of ripple effect outwards, so that by the time you get to the 11th century, everything has changed. And he said the ripple goes on through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, right through to today, where our laws, our culture, our institutions, so much of what we take for granted as being part of the Western world is actually impacted by the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul grew up in Tarsus. Tarsus is in modern-day Turkey, and it was a very important place. It was, as it were, on the coast. Well, it was actually 14 kilometers inland from the Mediterranean, but there was a river, and so there was a dock there. And also the Roman road came through there. And so it was open to many influences during the lifetime of the Apostle Paul. Because the Roman Empire has extended, as it were, into Judea, so now this road became the trade route. And the Apostle Paul, though he grew up as a Jew, and that was very important, certainly his father, a Pharisee, called him Saul. Why did he call him Saul? Well, because he was a very strict Pharisee, and he knew Saul was the first king of Israel, but Saul is also a shortened version of Samuel, and Samuel was the last of the judges and the kingmaker, great prophet. So give your son the name Saul and bring him up with the teaching of the Pharisees. So he studied every day the Talmud, and at the age of 15 was sent off to Jerusalem, there to study under Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the grandson of Hillel. Rabbi Hillel was one of the most important founders of the Pharisaic laws. And so all of this training in the religion of the Jews was important, of course, not only for his work among the Jews, but also in terms of our understanding of the scriptures. Much of our understanding of the Old Testament comes when we see it in the New Testament context and in relation to Jesus Christ. But then consider this. He also has been trained to look after himself. He has a trade. What trade did he get? A tent maker. Why a tent maker? Because the cloth that was used for the tenting came from the particular goat that lives around Tarsus. And so now he has to learn a trade. Listen to this. This is one of the Talmudic writers who says, "It was the custom among the Jews that all boys should learn a trade. What is commanded of a father toward his son," he asks, "to circumcise him, to teach him the law, and to teach him a trade." One of the other rabbis said this, "He that teacheth not his son a trade doth the same as if he taught him to be a thief." Very important. It meant that as Paul was traveling later on in his life, he could stay somewhere and support himself. So he would be a preacher of the gospel, a great missionary, but not dependent upon others. When eventually he did need help, it was the church at Philippi that would be helping him. And the other thing is this. You see, while Paul would study daily the Jewish writings, he was living among Romans. This was a Roman colony. Can you imagine going down to the docks there in Tarsus, and he's mixing with other boys, Greek boys, Roman boys, and all of that gives him an international view of life, which would certainly be of great importance later on. But not only that, he was exposed to the cultures. There was a library in Tarsus with 200,000 books. So it was a center of learning. And so Paul was imbibing all of this. And of course, you remember that when he became a Christian, the church in Jerusalem wouldn't accept him. They were very suspicious of him because they thought he had, as it were, pretended to become a Christian in order that he could find out who the leaders were and eventually have them arrested. Of course, that wasn't the case, but it meant that he was not accepted in Jerusalem. So what did he do? He went down to Saudi Arabia today, or as it was just called Arabia in those days. And so he was exposed then to another culture. And part of the time he spent in Syria, but then eventually he does make contact with the leadership in Jerusalem. But again, they send him off to Tarsus. And we forget that he had 10 years in Tarsus before his missionary journeys started, before Barnabas came and collected him and took him off to Antioch. 10 years of being exposed to that culture. What was God doing? I believe that he was doing the same with the Apostle Paul as he did with me, as he did with Dr. John Roach, as he's done with so many other people. Remember, we're so fond of quoting, aren't we, from Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. For it is by grace you've been saved through faith, not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not because of works, so that no man can boast. The very next verse, we are created in Christ Jesus to do the good works which God prepared in advance for us to do. So God has a plan for your life. He's been preparing you right from the beginning. And here's the question, the very important question. The preparation that God gave to the Apostle Paul, how much did that impact the rest of his life? I believe profoundly. I believe we would not have had the New Testament scriptures that we have today without the Lord's preparation and the Lord's preservation. You remember when he went down to Lystra on his first missionary journey? and he was stoned by the Jews, and he was actually left for dead. I'd love to know who looked after him when he was found. I wonder if it was Timothy's mother. I don't know. But somebody looked after him. More than that, God looked after him. I ask myself the question, if he had died from that stoning, would we have had the New Testament as we have it today? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We would not have had the letters, and we would have been left then only with the gospel narrative. And it's quite possible that if that had happened, it would have just been locked in Israel. And there had been many other people who professed to be messiahs. We don't know what the full story would have been. But I do know this, that with the preparation that God gave and the preservation that he gave, we have the New Testament that we have today, and we have the world that we have today. I think it was Tom Wright who said, had it not been for the Apostle Paul, much of the world would have been polytheistic, believing in many gods. It's through the Apostle Paul that we get the understanding of the one God revealing himself through the people of Israel, through the Jews, that we know today as the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. What about you? Are you doing today what God prepared for you to do today? You know, it's never too late. John found out when he was in retirement. Maybe that's a question you should be asking